Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
This is David McCarricker, and you're listening to Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk about something I wrote on Substack recently about Zizek and Dugan and Samuel Huntington, who's dead, so everybody forgets about him. Uh, yeah, I wrote this thing up in part because of, you know, I was thinking a little bit about Mikey, and Mikey saying, it'd be good to get a little bit more specific about certain things.
I'm
Wouldn't that be nice if we
I'm
were more
hold
specific?
hold on. I think we might have an
Yeah.
issue with the audio.
Oh,
We might have to start
audio
it over.
problem.
Folks in the
Okay.
chat, I see there's 18 of you listening. Please let us know what's going on with the audio. It looks like I've got noise coming through my microphone while Benjamin's talking, and that shouldn't be happening. It should be completely dead silent on my side. What are you all seeing on your side? Oh, you know what it might be? Oh, okay. This computer had to run some updates. I think that's all it was. So Lighthouse didn't start. Let's
Oh,
see. No, I don't think it's working. Whatever. I think we can hear you just fine. So, Bogdan said it ain't too bad, but there's some noise, low
it
key.
it could be a tree. There is a tree in my neighborhood that is being cut down, and so occasionally you may hear the saws running on that tree. It's in the distance, but it's possible that that could be a factor.
No, it's that I'll just have to mute myself if I'm typing, because I have software that should make it so that it doesn't pick up on typing. You're coming through over Zoom, so we can't hear the tree. We can't hear anything on your side except for you, which is perfect. I have
Oh,
to
beautiful.
do extra stuff to make it that way on my end, but let's just, now that I know that, we're good. I just won't type while you're talking. Perfect. Okay, so bringing it back around, I want to just say a couple of things about this. So a lot of people don't know who Slavoj Žižek or Alexander Dugin are, and very few people know who Samuel Huntington is, as you were saying. And so I wanted to say a couple quick introductory notes about why Alexander Dugin versus Slavoj Žižek is an interesting opposition, and then kind of set you up to dive into how you contrast them. And then at that point, we could pull up the graph for folks who will have eyeballs on the screen. For those who are listening, don't worry, we'll explain the graph and what it looks like. You can envision it in the paint of your mind, which is Benjamin Studebaker made a graph all on his own on Paint, everybody. And so it's on the thumbnail. You can go look at it now. But what I want to say about Dugan is when I was burning out on the left and looking around and trying to see who's trying to figure out something new, one of the things being passed around in the discourse was Alexander Dugin's work, and especially his book, The Fourth Political Ideology. And I'll give you all the very short version. He says that the three political ideologies, the only real three political ideologies that have had real force or any kind of movement or potential in modernity were liberalism, communism, fascism. He says that each one of these has serious problems, but each one of these also has some kind of an insight that the others lack. And then, so I forget what he says is good about liberalism. And the fact is he doesn't like liberalism very much anyway. And then communism, his problem with it is that it's chauvinist and it's cultural imperialism. And then his problem with fascism is that it's racist, obviously, scapegoating ethnic others and stuff like that. What he's trying to do with his fourth political ideology is say there's a way forward where we can kind of take the best of these three things. The issue is that's not going to be possible because liberalism won. And in winning, liberalism became totalitarian. So we have liberal totalitarianism, which I know is a position that Marcuse would agree with him on. And not a lot of leftists would agree with him on that. And for examples of that, you could think of books, popular books like the Jakarta Method, right? The kinds of subterfuge and terrorism used to undermine political movements in South American countries, for instance. The U.S., in the name of democracy, does all kinds of crazy stuff abroad, right? And so it's totalitarian in this sense. Dugan doesn't like that. And then Dugan's daughter was killed last year. And I bring this up because he's not just a theorist, right? He's actually a highly controversial political figure. He's not just a theorist. Some people say he's like the theorist to Putin. Now, some people will say that's outlandish and ridiculous. It's not true at all. But be that what it may, Dugan's been around for a long time. He's quite the networker. He speaks over 17 languages. He's written like 18 volumes of world history. And he is really big on the idea that every culture has its own sort of distinct, organic, geo-linguistic integrity, and that cannot be washed away without it becoming a kind of genocide. He gets this obviously from the sort of post-colonial discourse. And the reason I brought in his daughter being killed last year, well, some people say it was the CIA that did this. Some people say it was just some terrorist group inside of Russia. But either way, the car bomb that killed his daughter was meant for him. And then you can say, oh, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, besides the fact that the Democratic Party has been trying to go to war with Russia, and you can't actually find any of Dugan's books online, at least not through places like Amazon. Like, they have been completely blacklisted. And so, Democrats are all about, the right wants to ban books today, and, well, Dugan's banned pretty much everywhere. He's definitely one of those banned books. And so you feel kind of edgy reading him. You feel kind of dangerous. It's like, ooh, I'm reading Dugan. And I was listening to him while working out in some applewood tree orchards, right? And I remember thinking, like, I like the succinctness of this, but it seems a little dangerous in its oversimplicity. And then there is, of course, this interesting additional component where if you're trying to fuse together elements of people who would have been fascist or would have been communist, but you've gotten them to be less racist and less chauvinistic, and now you've got them working together against liberalism, what does that actually look like? And I don't know enough about the global situation and geopolitics to really know, but I knew enough just from listening to it that I was like, oh, okay. So the reason he works with a press that works with someone like a Richard Spencer back in the day is because these sort of linguistic, ethno-geographical, organic unities that he talks about as being these distinct cultures would probably include like white ethno-states. That's the way that you have like this, oh, we're not racist. We just believe that everybody should have their own special area kind of alliance. And so that's where I'm coming from with my knowledge to now of Dugan. I like how you plot him in relation to these other two figures. And so I want to get into that. Slavoj Zizek, everyone should be a lot more familiar with him, but he's a cultural critic. He's the Elvis of cultural theory, and he's a friend of this channel. He wrote a foreword to my book, but I've always made this hardline distinction, maybe he doesn't like it, between his theory, how he uses Hegel and Lacan to rethink the political economic situation, and then how he actually applies that with his political takes, which we can get into more later. And then Samuel Huntington, I don't know anything about him. And so, Benjamin, how are you thinking with these three, and what got you to write this article?
Yeah, so it was listening to Mikey talk about how it would be nice for people to get more specific and detailed about things that made me think, wouldn't it be fun to schematize something a little bit, at least something that can be discussed and talked about? So I made this triangle of essentialism. What I am kind of arguing here is that you've got, three different theories. You've got a theory that is of the left, a theory of liberalism, and then a theory that is of the East Asian right. And these are really three different positions that all involve dividing the world up into essentially different cultural spheres and then taking a side in the struggle among those spheres and then hoping that the other spheres will collapse and balkanize and break up into little bits and be weak forever so that the sphere that is your sphere can be strong and can have its way. And really, all three of the theorists in the triangle of essentialism, from their different ideological standpoints, have a side that is their side, and they have enemies that they want to see balkanized, broken up, and weakened and destroyed, if possible. And in this sense, they all have something in common. They've all taken sides in the world system. They don't view the world system as a whole. And they think any attempt to view the world system as a whole is necessarily a concession to one of the enemies, right? So from Dugan's point of view, if you view the world as a whole, then you're just adopting a liberal perspective, because that's the only way in which the world can be viewed that way. It can only be viewed that way against him. Conversely, if you, from Zizek's point of view, take the world as a whole, then you're appeasing Putin and you're making it easier for Putin to make progress because you are not standing up to him and stopping him from destroying Europe, right? Or from, say, Huntington's point of view, if you take the world as a whole, you'll allow all of these Latin American immigrants into the United States. And he thinks that that will cause all kinds of cultural problems in the United States. So in all of these different cases, you have a view which at its roots, at its core intellectually, is communist, liberal, or conservative. And you can find in each of these thinkers stuff that is communist, liberal, or conservative that would seem totally innocuous, right? Because all of them come out of these traditions, which were 100 years ago much more universalist in the way that they pitched themselves politically. In the early 1900s, conservatives, liberals, and communists all thought of themselves as having an ideology that was for the world, that was a way of managing the issues that come up in a world where everybody is making contact with each other. You can only really have separated little bubble people in a world where people don't interact. The more people interact, the more this interaction is itself part of what is going on. And it has to be theorized about. And if you insist that despite whatever interaction may be occurring, each of these things is separate and distinct and has a totally different essence, it makes it very hard for the theory to grasp the interaction and the meaningfulness of it. It can only be understood as somebody's trying to dominate somebody else. It can only be understood as someone is my enemy and someone is trying to destroy me. But really, if you have this globalized system, what I argue in the piece is that it makes for different niches in this system. Different states specialize in performing different roles in the global economy. They do this because if they don't do it, they will be economically much worse off. All states are subject to some kind of demand on them that they specialize. And if you talk to human beings all over the world, they're all looking for the same stuff. They want to consume more or they want to work less. Just about anywhere in the world you go, one or the other or both of those is the objective for the people there, regardless of what religion, what language, what the history is, whether you have a democracy, whether you have an authoritarian state. All of these things don't really touch this fundamental truth about people, which is that we want to be comfortable and happy, and we don't want to have to do things that we regard as drudgery or toil. And if you take that into account, that that really is the most important fact about people, then you start to see the struggling that goes on in a very different way. What are these people really doing? They're trying to consume more and they're trying to work less. And they're trying to use their position in the system to accomplish that as best they can. And if it looks like it makes sense to pursue a military strategy to do that, then that's what they do. And if it
Mm,
looks like it makes sense to deregulate your labor market to do that, then that's what they do. And if it seems to make sense to get really repressive and to, send tanks around to bully people, then that's what they do. But what they're really doing is they're trying to grow their economies. And they're trying to do this in a way that doesn't get them killed. And so when we're talking about these different, civilizations, we're really just talking about different places that are optimized for different niches, right? So if we're talking about the United States, we're really talking about a state that is heavily, heavily optimized for consumption, right? It used to be optimized for production, and then it made a shift into consumption. And at this point, the United States is the most optimized for consumption of any state in the world, which makes all the states that produce somewhat dependent on it to consume the surplus of what is produced, especially the garbage, the stuff that no one else would buy. If you operate some factory that makes plastic crap somewhere, the Americans are the only people who are going to keep you in business. Nobody else is
right.
going to buy your plastic crap. And this makes you dependent on the Americans. They have to continue to be able to buy the crap that you're making, right? And that means, if necessary, if there's a problem in the American economy, it's a huge problem for you. If you make plastic crap, you can't cheer on the collapse of the United States because economically that would destroy you, right? And it's not just true for plastic crap. To varying degrees, it's true about most things. Most things ultimately would become much less profitable if there were major problems in the United States and the United States broke up or collapsed. Indeed, China would be much worse off if that happened. And it's not at all in China's interest for the United States to break up and collapse. Conversely, the United States needs states to produce stuff cheaply so that it can go on consuming. But there are lots of states that can produce. Factories now are very easy to pick up and move, with the exception of a narrow number of industries that are tied by where minerals happen to be located in the world geographically to specific places. Most industries at this point could occur almost anywhere in the world. And this means that there is much more of a stake that the rest of the world has in American economic growth than the reverse. The United States can pick winners and losers in the world of producers much more easily than the producer states can pick winners or losers in the world of consumption. Now, that's frustrating to everybody involved, right? The producer states don't like the fact that they are at the whims of the United States. They need access to the American market, right? They hate that. And they don't like the fact that they're constantly in a competition with other states to produce as cheaply as possible, because it means that they get bad deals all the time. They have to sell the stuff they make for too
Mm,
little, right? And they have to pay their people too little, and then their people aren't able to consume that much. And the whole reason they spec'd into production is that they wanted a higher standard of living than they could get by being farming and extraction economies. China used to make a lot of rice, and rice is just not that good a commodity for trying to make a country with a very large population very rich. Mineral wealth in agriculture is not a good basis for making a country extremely rich, right? Russia has a ton of oil and gas, but it's also got 200 million people. It's very difficult to make a country with 200 million people rich off of extracting mineral wealth. If you're Saudi Arabia and you've got 6 million people, it's a different story, right? But if you're Russia, this is not the niche you want to be in. Yet Russia has struggled over the last 30, 40 years to become a producer state and to compete with the other producer states like China, like India, right? And Russia has struggled to be brought into the circle of consumption that the United States operates with its allies, those allied states. Part of the terms of being part of the American alliance structure is that you get to be one of the consumer states. You don't consume as much as the Americans do, but you get a consumption bump relative to other countries in the world. Uh, this is really what's going on. It's not that there are these essentially distinct cultural groups. Everybody's in the same mess here. We're all human beings trying to solve a common problem, which is how do we work less and consume more? And when you start to see the world this way, it becomes much easier to make sense of what people are doing. If you have to try to come up with some mystery box, what is it special, mystical about people in this other part of the world that makes them the way that they are? You end up having to just invent a lot of stereotypes that, for one, aren't really true, and for two, don't explain very much.
It seems to me like on the one side, uh, the simple sort of rebuttal to all this is to say that uh, it's too materialistic. It's not taking into account the history of all these peoples, the ancient grudges, the need for some sense of justice for people who've been historically oppressed, right? And that you'll get both left and right versions of this, and that this sort of counter narrative would also say not only is there like a uniqueness that can be lost to a culture, but also that a people needs its own recognition. Like this is where we get these kinds of they need a state. There needs to be a state for these people. They don't have a state.
Right.
Right.
The response is to throw a tantrum and insist on the reality of the ontological units. There are peoples and they're different and they need special states. It's just
Yeah.
to insist on the ontic unit because they are completely stuck in thinking in terms of these separate and distinct ontic units, which they've just asserted. They've just asserted. It doesn't help to explain the behavior we see in the world to assert this stuff. Why is it that China, a state which was bullied and tormented by the Western powers in the 19th century, decided to abandon the Soviet Union, even though both states were committed to state socialism, right? Abandon the Soviet Union and become allies with the United States and to trade enormously with the United States? Why did China do that? Well, it did that because it wanted to get out of the agriculture and resource extraction niche and develop. And the United States offered China a path to development. The Soviet Union wanted to use China as a market for itself. It was not willing to offer China a path to development, in part because the Soviet Union did not want a powerful, strong China in its backyard with a larger population than it. It didn't want a powerful, strong China taking the consumption niche away from it. The Soviet Union ran the second system in a very nasty way, which caused many socialist states to want out of it, including Yugoslavia and China, right? And why is it that Zizek has this animosity toward the Russians? It's in part because Yugoslavia wanted out of the second system so it could chart its own course and get richer faster. And it did. By joining the West after the breakup, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, these states got richer faster. And what happened to the states that didn't join or were slower to join, like Serbia? They haven't gotten rich as fast, right? And in the case of China, China joined the Western system and got enormously rich. And now the Russians are talking about buddying up with China, but this is after a long time in which Putin tried to petition the West to be the friend of the West. Putin tried to get Russia into NATO, into the European Union for many years. Why did he do that if he has some kind of civilizational grudge against the West? Well, because he wanted to explore the possibility that maybe Russia could get rich in the Western sphere by becoming one of those core consumer states. And it's only after it became abundantly clear, many, many years, many, many attempts to get in with, the reset button and all of the different things that they tried to do to make the relationship work. It's only after that that he said, this isn't going to work for me. In fact, what is happening is that the former states of the Second World System are becoming part of the West, and they're going to never let us in. They're going to take all of the states that used to be part of our bloc and put them in, and see, they start thinking in terms of blocks. And once you start thinking in terms of blocks, once you start thinking of yourself as cut off or isolated, then you start trying to take measures to protect yourself from the consequences of your isolation. And states do this by getting very focused on making their zone where they can trade and move around freely as big as it can be. and they start getting very parochial about territory.
Mm.
But they're doing this because they're in a bad situation. They don't like their niche. They're not able to get out of their niche and transition to a niche that would make them richer. No one's giving them a way out or a good option. So they're being forced to become increasingly repressive internally and in the way that they treat their neighbors as they try to keep a regime that's being isolated going, right? During the conflict with Ukraine, Russia has invested mightily in industrial production. And some people argue, look, the conflict is good for Russia's production. Russia's increasing production because it's been cut off. The trouble is, the Russian industry is not competitive. If Russia were integrated back into the system, a lot of the industries that it's creating now would not be competitive and they would collapse. These are industries that are being created because Russia's being isolated. The last time Russia was isolated, it was very bad for the Soviet economy. It resulted in the Soviet economy losing competitiveness gradually and reaching a point where, when it was reintegrated into the system, all of these legacy industries had to be folded up because they couldn't compete in the global trade system. It's a bad situation for the Russians, and we should be sympathetic to them because they don't have any easy way out of the conundrum that they're in, right? We
Mm.
aren't giving them an
Hmm.
easy way out, and China wants to treat them the same way that they wanted to treat China back in the day, right? China doesn't want Russia to be a rich consumer state that can tell it what to do. It wants Russia to be in a niche that is subservient to it, right? States do struggle with each other. They compete with each other, but they do it within a system of interconnectedness that very much governs the way in which that competition occurs. And this system of interconnectedness, we may not like it. We may wish that it didn't work this way, but it is a fact of life. And when you try to break out of it, it makes you very poor very quickly. And this can cause your government to collapse, right? It can cause you to lose elections. This unilateralism is extremely expensive politically and economically to actually do it, which is why in practice, while a lot of these theorists and a lot of these states will talk about going their own way and doing their own thing, when push comes to shove, they are always trying to stay part of the system and to get the best possible niche within it. That's what's
Mm.
always in all of their interests at every point, all of them. And that's what they got in common. And that's why they compete so hard with each other. It's because of what they have in common that they are so competitive and they have such difficult arguments and fights with each other. It's not because they're fundamentally different. It's because we're all human beings. And yet the world system does not produce a situation where we can all be consumers or where we can all be freed from labor. That is
Right.
zero sum in this system to some degree. Not completely, but to some degree. There is growth, but there's a lot of zero sum competition for niches.
This
And the thing
this
is, nobody wants to talk about this. Back in the 90s, there was all this focus on globalization, the end of history, the fall of the second system. Everybody's in one system, everybody's in the WTO, right? Everybody wanted there to be some way of resisting that because it felt like a stultifying logic. But instead of coming together to try to overcome that logic or govern it or make it more manageable for everybody in the world, people ran away into their little holes and started insisting that various tiny little aspects of the way people talk or the way people interact are more important than the fact that we want to consume more and work less.
mm. Hmm. I like the I
And it
like the
became
fr-
very popular.
I like the framing of it being, this people want to consume more and work less. And I think this is a nice potential segue into my biggest issue with Dugan, but also all of these sort of Cold War era thinkers, which is something you point out in your article. Zizek and Dugan both come of age and make careers for themselves in a time of the Cold War, right?
Yeah, and specifically of the end of the Cold War. Huntington is the earliest of the three. That's why he's dead. And Huntington had this huge reputation. He became very, very big in the 60s and 70s with a theory of that was really institutionalist. And it was about how creating centralized institutions gives states competitive advantages, right? And the thing that was powerful about his theory in the 60s is that it could explain both the strength of the Western states and the strength of the Soviet Union, because it focused on centralization as the thing that's institutionally necessary as a prerequisite for growth. So it was very, very institutional. Of
Hmm.
course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, this caused a problem for Huntington because his theory had emphasized the strengths of that system. So then Huntington had to come up with why it was that the Soviet Union collapsed and why it was that being centralized, having a centralized state in and of itself was not the solution to all of your problems. And what he did over the course of the early 90s, and it begins with an article he wrote in, I think, 1992, 1993, and then there's a book, Clash of Civilizations, that comes along later that expands on that article. What he did is he posited that it had to do with religious or cultural differences, that some people, even if they have these institutions, they won't have the relevant kinds of norms or social practices, and that this comes out of deep history. And this became a way of explaining why it is that some states have institutions that would seem to suggest that they should grow, but they don't. Now, of course, another way of explaining this would be to just look at the trade blocks, look at the niches these states are in. Why did the Soviet Union fail? Well, the Soviet Union failed, A, because its institutions were undynamic. It was hard for it to produce change internally without a civil conflict. But B, and this is more important, because this is what separates the Soviet Union from China, it got trapped in a trade bloc that was too small. So it had limited options in terms of trade partners, which meant that when the crisis of the 70s came, the Soviet Union had very limited mechanisms for dealing with that crisis relative to the United States. The United States could go, we have too much inflation. I know, let's offshore a lot of these industries and move them to China, our new allied state. Let's move them overseas, because then we can push down the amount that we're paying our workers, and that will control inflation. And in the 80s, you get this huge pile of relatively inexpensive goods made all over the world flowing into the United States. So even though the wages are not growing very much, people are able to buy a lot. Their purchasing power becomes quite high in the 80s, especially when it comes to consumer goods, the things that used to be really expensive for the boomers in the 60s, a new pair of jeans. All of this becomes super cheap in the 80s. So even though people's wages aren't growing as much as they did in the 50s and 60s, and even though things like housing, healthcare, education are becoming more expensive, in terms of your day-to-day life, when you go to the store, people in the 80s experienced that decade as, wow, I can buy all kinds of stuff. Oh, and there are video games now. There's, new kinds of
Right,
entertainment.
right.
Whoa, there's an internet. There's cable TV. People are experiencing a richness in terms of their day-to-day life. This comes out of the ability of the United States to leverage the size of the trade system that it created around itself. The Soviet Union was not able to do this. Indeed, it lost states during the Cold War, precious states like China, right? Why is it that Harry Truman was so unpopular back in the 50s? He was so unpopular because he was accused of having lost China by allowing the Maoists to take power there. Why does it matter? Well, if you have a state that's got 1 billion people and it's not in your trade system and it's in the other state's trade system, and you have two trade systems and they're separate from each other, and they really were separate. If you look at US Soviet trade, it was just about nothing. It was very, very low, very low. There were isolated incidents where you did get a little bit more interaction, but for the most part, especially compared with anything like now, trade volumes between the two systems in the Cold War were very low. So you really could speak of two systems to a very
Hmm.
large degree, right? So if you lose a state like China to the second system, and that's, by the way, where first world, second world, third world comes from, it comes from this. The first world is the system around the United States. The second world is the system around the Soviet Union. And the third world is states that are not neatly aligned with either bloc and have to play the two blocks off against each other for advantage, right? That's the Cold War, really. So a state like China, in going into the first world, completely destroys the capacity of the second world to leverage size and leverage diversity of economic situations and niches. It causes all of the states in the second world to try to do everything.
Mm.
And this is the problem with the Soviet Union. It's trying to consume, it's trying to produce, it's trying to extract, it's trying to do all these things at once. It can't specialize, right? It can't make transitions because the cost of any kind of transition is huge. There are no other states it can leverage, no other states it can trade with. The other states that are in the second world system are much poorer than it, don't have access to a lot of resources. Now, this is the problem. But this is not grasped by people who want to insist that it comes down to differences in the Russian language or the Orthodox Church or blah, blah, blah. Come on.
Altitude.
The Chinese are Confucians. The Chinese have, all sorts of traditional baggage, but they survived the Cold War and the Soviet Union did not. Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party was that much better, more dynamic than the Soviet Communist Party? Come on. What happened is that the Chinese, after making all kinds of mistakes in the 60s and 70s in terms of five-year plan, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, they buddied up with the United States. They got a good niche. The Americans, to solve a domestic crisis, chucked a ton of investment into their production sector and grew the hell out of them. And they did great. And they had a great time. And they love Richard Nixon there because he helped them. And Richard Nixon loves them because they helped him beat the Soviet Union. And that's the most important event of the Cold War is Nixon getting China.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know that. And that's one of the things about why I left, everybody, is that for the most part, this is Benjamin explaining how the world works, and then me torturing him by showing him culture war stuff. We're at the 36-minute mark. We're basically going to go for another 25 minutes to close out this section, or maybe 20 minutes to close out this first side of the episode, the A side. I wanted to make a quick aside about the A versus B side and say there's been some weird stuff with the way that this is all being posted online. Something didn't work out the way we thought it was going to work out. So for the time being, everything's free. There was a little while where people were signing up to the Substack to access the B-sides. For the next couple weeks, you'll be able to access the B-sides through Spotify and everything like that free, just fine. But in the very near future, we'll be back on the kind of old style. There's like the A-sides, that's public. And then to access the B-sides, you'll have to go through the Substack or the Patreon. We'll figure it out. But in the last 20 minutes, I want to talk about anti-imperialism. It's very popular right now. I want to bring up a couple of the comments from the chat, and I want to touch on Haas as probably one of the most famous and or iconic anti-imperialists on the internet today. Haas is the sort of charismatic leader of mega communism, and we're going to be talking to him in 2 days. So I wanted to just let all of our listeners know that it's kind of an interesting crossover in our world. The idea that we'll be talking to Haas, that's kind of crazy. But Benjamin's going to be joining us for that one. It's going to be an epic marathon stream here at Theory Underground. These are something that we've been doing for over a year and a half, right? Yeah, Benjamin, you've been on for a bunch of MSUs, haven't you?
Yeah, at this point, I think I've done a fair few of them.
Yeah, but this will be the first time that you're joining as a co-host with me and Nance. So
yeah, I'm excited to do that. I'm also grateful to be, allowed to do that. I mean, you have to be kind of in the group to do that.
You're in the club now. That's right. And the goal with Haas is not to try to corner him and get a bunch of gotchas on him or anything like that. It's to introduce him to the audience and also get to know him. And so we'll be asking him lots of questions. Some of those questions, I imagine, just based off of everything that Benjamin said so far, might be questions that he's never gotten before. I think a lot of people are challenging him on communism itself. They don't like communism. Or they're challenging him on MAGA because they don't like the idea that we should make America great again. Or, its associations with Trump. And of course, there's this sort of viral memeability to putting those two controversial signifiers together and then making that into something else. Hawes is kind of like Hassan Piker or Destiny or Walsh, right? Three different colors of liberals to leftists, except that he's obviously on this sort of extreme end in this sort of communism side, but also he gets called a National Bolshevik. He gets called a Duganite. And why? It's because he does draw off of Heidegger and Dugan. Now, of course, I draw off of Heidegger, but I don't do it in this Duganite way. And in fact, I critique Heidegger for doing what Dugan does with him, which a lot of liberals will just deny that Heidegger can be read this way. I will argue he must be read this way, but that Dugan and Heidegger are just wrong. Hawes takes a lot of inspiration from that. And so anyway, we'll be getting into this over the course of the next several episodes, I imagine here, maybe the next few seasons, because this anti-imperialism thing is not going to go away anytime soon. A lot of people who live in the first world, or whatever we want to call it, don't feel very good about living here. A lot of people who are getting into politics, they feel like they are part of this labor aristocracy. They feel like they are very privileged, like the cheapness of their cheeseburgers, if we can still call those cheap, comes from the exploitation of the third world. And the kinds of questions that came up in chat that relate to this are, what about indigenous peoples? How do they fit into all of this schema that you've got up on the screen? By the way, I do have the graph up on the screen. It's been up there the whole time we've been talking. And so what about indigenous people? How do they fit into this? And then somebody was asking how this relates to Wallerstein's world system theory, because they said that it sounds very similar, except that yours is more economics based. So what would you? That's a lot. What do you want to do with that?
Yeah, the Wallerstein world systems theory is certainly interesting and fun to play with. Part of my emphasis here that might be a little different is I'm not framing it all the way in terms of either a global capitalist class against a global proletariat, nor am I framing it entirely as a bunch of different states that are in competition, but I'm mixing together both of those elements and doing it deliberately. This thing is very much a hybrid of, if you're familiar with IR, realism and Marxism, and liberalism, because it also emphasizes economics and trade. It is an attempt to take into account all of those different things. The circle here is really key, because inside the circle, we have three things that I placed: liberal institutionalism, socialist internationalism, classical republicanism, and then I put Plato at the center because I love him, right? But what do we got there? What do we got there? These are, the ways of thinking about the world together, and they're different ways of thinking about the world together, but there are things we can learn from and put together and draw from, because they are all interested ultimately in thinking about the world together as a common thing, right? We can be very syncretic with regard to how we think, as long as we are not making ontological commitments that prevent syncretism. And if you say each of these things is distinct and has to be held apart, and any interaction among them is necessarily one polluting the other, then you can't be syncretic and you can't draw on insights from multiple different traditions. As soon as you start to do that, the mixing is a potential threat to the ontology, and therefore itself becomes something that must be treated as dangerous. And this is why the circle is there. The circle is an acknowledgement that conservatism, liberalism, and socialism all have things that we can learn from, right? But outside of the circle, when we enter the triangle of essentialism, then we have these perspectives that say, no, you can't mix this stuff together. There have to be separate things. The systems have to be separate. Each of these people needs a separate thing. Now, if you keep doing that, you won't just get a first world, a second world, and a third world. You'll get 99 worlds. You'll get 1,300 worlds. You'll get 10,000 worlds. And this is where the question about the tribes is so helpful, right? If you treat each of the tribes as entitled to its own system, separate, distinct from all the other systems, by this point, now you have something which is incompatible completely with the way anything has worked in the world at any point for quite a long time. If we look around the world at the tribes, There are a very, very small handful of quite tiny tribes in remote areas that have not been contacted, that are genuinely separate in some sense or other from the world system. Insofar as they are connected, they're not aware of the connections, right? But for the most part, most of the tribes have interacted with the rest of this system. And because they've interacted with the rest of this system, they have been integrated into it and they play roles in it at this point. Those roles often are very bad for people who are members of the tribes. They keep them poor. They put tribes on reservations that are very low land value, that don't have much in the way of good agricultural wealth, don't have much in the way of good mineral wealth. There aren't investments that are made into production on tribal lands, so you don't get industrialization generally occurring there. And then what happens? Well, oftentimes they invite the tribes to grow by speccing into things like gambling, because they'll make legal allowances on tribal land to engage in forms of economic activity that are illegal elsewhere. And what does that do? It causes the tribe to become built around the industry of gambling,
Yeah,
which has an
something that
incredibly
is
negative effect on the members of the
it's
tribe.
it's something that ruins lives, and it kind of it's reminiscent of when you think about the origins of anti-Semitism and how they Jews acquired this sort of stigma of always calculating and trying to use what was called usury by the church, right? And it's because they were forced out of all other professions, and so the only way that they could do anything was to start dealing in loans. And it's like, well, it's seems kind of similar when you force a people into a situation where the only way they can make money is by ruining people's lives with gambling, you know.
Yeah, though that is less true of the Jews than people generally believe historically. Yes, I take your
Really?
point. Yeah, less true than people think. Uh,
Okay.
but uh, but yes, uh, this is part of it. If you compel people to occupy a particular niche, you give them no alternatives to that niche, then of course that niche structures their life. And economic niches never fit with pre-capitalist, pre-modern, pre-contact with other populations, values, traditions. None of that fits with interaction. All of that is designed for a different kind of world that went away many hundreds of years ago. Many hundreds of years ago. The point at which all of these different populations were contacted and integrated into the world system and changed forever by that integration occurred hundreds of years ago. And if you regret that contact, you could feel that way, but it doesn't accomplish anything for anybody. It's not possible for people to return to a world without contact. The values and traditions from the pre-contact period are not fully understood, even by the people from these societies who still speak the languages, because they are cut off from the experience of all of that. And to try to get there now would involve impoverishing huge numbers of people. It would involve degrading our capacity to produce goods and services to the point at which enormous numbers of people would starve to death in famines. It's not practical. It has nothing to do with what's necessary to make people alive. And ultimately, when we're talking about how do we do things as people, it has to be compatible with producing the means of subsistence. It has to be. And this is not just me insisting upon a perspective. We all eat, guys. We all shit. We all drink water. We all build shelters of one kind or another. This is what people have to do. And, people can orientalize and fetishize other population groups in other parts of the world and try to impute some kind of special outside of the system status. The reason that this is being done is that people don't like the way the system works. And they shouldn't. It's bad. It's a bad system that exploits everybody. And everybody, by the way. One of the worst things that comes out of this is that people start to go, well, if I live in the West, then I'm living good. And therefore, I don't deserve to live better. Well, actually, even being in a consumption niche is not great for you. When you're in the consumption niche, people are constantly trying to lend you money all the time because they want you to keep buying stuff. And they want to work you to the bone all day long so that you will be tired and exhausted and you'll want to consume your way out of your depression and anxiety and unhappiness, right? So one of the consequences of being in the consumer niche is that you're over indebted. The debt is used to control your life, force you to work. You're either paying your own debt or you're paying debts to make sure that your kids are able to go to the schools that they need to go to, or you're paying medical debt, or you're paying for your parents when your parents are elderly and they have medical debt. Some way, shape, or form. You've got a mortgage, you've got a car loan, you got credit card debt. You end up paying a ton of debt. And so you have to keep working and you can't change jobs and you're scared to get fired. All of this is also a consequence of your niche in this system. It's not like we have it great because we can buy plastic crap from China. It's like a drug, man. It's hard drugs,
Mm.
this consumption that we're doing. Hard drugs. And it controls us and it limits us. And it means that even though we're incredibly rich, we're not able to use that wealth to emancipate ourselves from labor. Because if we go through a period where there's a shortage of your favorite pizza at the supermarket, you won't vote for the incumbent because you're that addicted to the consumption. That addicted. If you have 5% inflation for 2 months, you'll punish the incumbent several years later at the polls. We're that addicted to everything's got to be cheap all the time. Everything's got to be there when I need it, when I want it. Right. But, this is something that is produced globally. And the people who are living in other parts of the world, of course, they'd like to consume more of what they produce and they'd like to work less and they'd like to work less hard. But we all have this in common. It's not a question of which niche are you in? Are you in the core or in the periphery? We are all struggling with the same global constraints. And especially now, back when Wallerstein was writing, there was a much sharper difference between the rich states and the poor states. Now there are people who consume a lot, who live in a lot of parts of the world where previously it wasn't really thought of it that those were consumption states. There's a middle class and an upper class, even in countries that we think of as not very rich. And conversely, there are people in first world, ostensibly first world countries that are falling through the cracks, that are living with very, very because the social safety nets have collapsed and the public services have been ripped to shreds. So we're all in the same boat. It's just a question of degree and which particular combination of bad things you're experiencing. But we have to work together with people everywhere if we want to overcome it. We are never going to overcome it by tearing up the interaction and trying to go back to, I don't know, 1491. That's not going to happen. We're never going to get back to some other kind of world where there's less interaction that takes place. All we can do is cause each other to get into wars that are destructive by trying to break this thing, experiencing economic deprivation as a consequence of what we're doing, and then trying to solve the economic deprivation with militarism and violence. That's all that the unilateralism will do ultimately for anybody. So we have to work together, and we can't be sitting here and going, oh, well, because you go through the consumer problem, you're better off than me because I've got the producer problem. No, we are all dealing with the problems of a system that is badly managed. And it's badly managed in part because it's not managed by and for us.
It's not by, and it's not for 100%. I want to, in our last 5 minutes or so here, bring it back to my biggest critique of Dugan, but also of, like I said, all of our elders. Really, we're talking about our elders here. And I do want to do a quick little aside here to say, not only is Zizek like a friend of the show and someone who's a big supporter of what we do here, but also we have been arguing at Theory Underground and before it was Theory Underground, back when I was doing Theory Plebe, ever since I started bringing Mikey onto the channel to teach me Lacan and Zizek, we have been arguing, or at least especially Mikey's been arguing, but I've also become convinced that there's something that Slavoj is dealing that you can't get from elsewhere. He has a theoretical approach that will be remembered 100 to 1,000 years from now. Now, will most of his books be remembered? Probably not, but there will be a couple, and he has written some great theory. But with that said, I still see him as an elder, and pretty much I feel the same way about him as I do about a lot of our elders, which is you respect them for the things that they're good at. You respect them also for, having some kind of dignity. But then outside of that, this term elder is to say, look, he is a remnant of a different century. He's made a imprint on the internet theory scene that will never go away probably because the Ljubljana School and the CCRU were there at the origins of the internet. And so in a lot of ways, the fault line established between these two schools of thought is something that we can't get outside of some kind of reference to. But with all of that said, time energy is what I'm always thinking about. Everything comes back to time energy. It's my axe to grind. I'm a time energy reductionist. And what that means for me is that with this, the way that I said, I like the way that you're framing it with less labor, more consumption. Everybody wants more consumption, less labor. And I know there's going to be some people who go, well, is that really sustainable? Can we really expand consumption for everybody? And outside of the thing I brought up in my piece on post-Marxism and the fact that we live in an infinite universe with more resources than anyone can possibly comprehend, outside of the fact that we could really do more material consumption in that sense if we really expanded into the universe in a strategic way. Outside of all of that, there is also a distinction between high and low pleasures, high and low consumer activities, if we're going to refer to high consumer activities as consumption in the first place. That's already arguable. But what I'm talking about when I say high consumer activities, I don't mean like going to the opera. I mean, which, maybe you could argue that it would include that. But what I'm talking about is those kinds of activities that you can't just pay someone else to do for you. You actually have to put your own time energy towards that activity. That's high consumerism. And so, the distinction here between high and low pleasures was something that comes up as a debate between Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, right? Jeremy Bentham thought pleasure's pleasure. And if a person gets pleasure from collecting push pins, then great. It's just the same. And then Mill was like, no. Actually, there's going to be higher and lower pleasures. And then a lot of people just kind of forget about this debate. But we're time energy, for me, large energy-infused, repeatable blocks of reliable time between us or between people in a society. It's the precondition for being able to study philosophy as a way of life. It's the precondition for being able to learn 6 instruments and play in 5 bands. It's the precondition for almost any kind of talent exploration and cultivation or relationship cultivation. It's the precondition, right? And so I want to bring this back to T3 institutions because this is something that you brought up in your lecture, your guest lecture earlier this year to the McCarricker seminar at TU. In your, what it was called, Time Energy Before Descartes, right? And basically, T3 institutions, they help you find your talent, they help you cultivate it under tutelage, which is to say a tutor, but most importantly, they supply the time energy free from the kinds of pressures and stresses that are going to derail you and make it so you're not able to cash in on those talents or really hone in the skills that would build up that talent into something that's respectable or rewarding. And so, let's bring it back to T3 institutions and how none of the options in this diagram, at least on the outsides, get us there.
Yeah, because if you have to engage in the kind of consumption that's necessary to keep all these producer and extractor states going, that kind of consumption is not compatible with developing yourself. Indeed, you have to be put in a position of mental unwell to consume enough to perform the necessary role as an American in this structure. You have to be constantly assaulted with a sense of inadequacy that can only be filled by things and by buying a huge house that's got room for all your things. And by buying a huge van that you can put all of your things in and all of the rest of it. There is a constant assailing. And so this consumption is never actually put toward the positive purpose. I don't know if you've ever read the Platonic dialogue, the Philebus.
No, I have not read the Philebus.
The Philebus is really cool. Way before Bentham and Mill, Plato does this whole schema of not just, what's the difference between pleasure and knowledge and reason, but also different kinds of pleasures, which kinds are better, which kinds are worse, and also what is most valuable to him is reason, because reason decides upon the limits of things, right? Pleasure in itself, he argues, is unlimited. It just goes on and on and on. And if your whole life is pleasure, then you never have an opportunity to think about anything. Because for him to think about something requires an ability to recollect it when it's not happening to you, right? So you need a respite from pleasure to be able to think about it and to be able to reason about it and to be able to decide upon the limits of it. And part of what has gone on in the consumer societies is that there is a constant experience of pleasure and pain without much in the way of limit that invades every part of life, so that there's never really an opportunity to reflect upon any of it or to decide what to do about any of it. And this is what keeps us in this treadmill of just, what's now, what's now, what's now, what's next, what's next, what's next. It also makes it very difficult for us to think about how could we cooperate with people in China, cooperate with people in India, cooperate with people in Russia, in Europe, in Africa, in South America, in Australia. How can we cooperate with tribes to make a world where we have the time energy to do the things that are actually valuable and worth doing, as opposed to just consuming, producing, extracting? How do we get time energy? And how do we get it for everybody in the world? Everybody in the world, rather than just our little group. Because if you try to get it just for your little group, the other groups in the world aren't going to like that very much.
Exactly.
That's not going to work out for you if you just try to get it for your little group. And we've been doing this whole thing where people try to get it for their little group for a long time. The institution of slavery is the institution of masters trying to get it from their slaves, ultimately. And there's lots of different ways of trying to launder that and cool it off and so on and so forth. But the thing that, really I want to get across is that this is something that has to be solved collectively. It is a global problem. It is not something that can be solved by retreating into a particular box and trying to convince yourself that the things that go on in that box are special and different and justify withdrawing, because it won't work. People will not tolerate it ultimately. They will not tolerate a collapse in living standards and famine and disorder that's brought about by you fetishizing cultural distinctions as a way of not grappling with a challenging global problem. And that's what it really is. People are not feeling like they have a way of dealing with this problem because it's too big, and it is very big and very difficult to get your hands on. And so they look for ways of making it small. In the literature, this is called glocalization. The more global problems become, the more people look for ways to make it something that they can deal with interpersonally, close by, immediately. And in doing this, they never get to the root of the global. And a lot of people, are just waiting for some disaster to happen and hoping it will happen to make the problem simpler. A lot of this desire for the apocalypse is a desire for a simpler version of this problem, where it's more straightforward what to do. But this is a way of not thinking. It's not a way of thinking.
Yeah, and this Dugan night approach was unsatisfying for me, largely because it completely misses the arms race on labor power that is necessary for the production of surplus value, and how that's always going to be a global thing. And his idea of multipolarism doesn't seem to address it. And then I'll just say, none of our elders seem to address it. So, I mean, this is not some shade on Zizek. I'm not trying to say anything
States
except
literally tried. They literally tried to run hermit kingdoms. Traditional empires in Asia literally tried to make hermit kingdoms and not interact to preserve their distinctiveness. Japan literally tried to do this. China literally tried to do this. It does not work. You fall further and further behind. You try to do everything, you become uncompetitive at everything, and then eventually somebody wants your market and they come in, and then you're at their mercy, and the terms on which you are admitted are worse than they would have been if you had traded and dealt with the fact that this is happening at the point at which you had the first opportunity. And I'm not saying that any of the theorists that I name here are bad people or not smart or not interesting. I'm just criticizing the essentialist part, the part in their theories where they make this kind of hard cut and go, no, each of these civilizations is different, and each of these civilizations needs its own special little world. You can't have your own special little world. It just doesn't work like that. And so many people historically have tried to have their own little world, and it just ends in death and poverty. That's all you get from it.
So we need to conquer, or at least tame and segregate, the realm of necessity and expand the realm of freedom, to put it in Gorsian terms. But like the point is like, if every country has to make their own ball bearings, that's extremely inefficient, right? And this is the problem with the anarchist commune. Okay, well, how are you going to make a bicycle, guys? At the end of the day, there are things that everybody needs, insofar as people have to busy themselves with the production of those needs. We could figure out a way to divide that up so that the overwhelming majority of humans on this earth do not spend the entirety of their lives just working and then recovering from work and engaging in, if consumerism at all, this lowbrow kind that is just, you pay the money, you get the cheeseburger, but also are able to instead, in the realm of freedom, sacrifice and commit and hone talents and relationships together. On the other side,
advantage is not just ideology. You actually will get significantly richer if you figure out how to use it. And if you don't figure out how to use it, and you treat trade and you treat competitive advantage like it's an evil thing that comes from an outside ideology, then you will not be competitive, and eventually people will invade you and conquer you and subjugate you. And if they don't do it militarily, they'll do it economically. You will end up eventually in a situation where your population is seeing on TV that other people have cheap blue jeans and they don't, and they'll riot, and you'll have to bulldoze them with tanks or make concessions to them. This is what happens if you don't engage with reality and you hide in a world of fantasy hermit kingdoms.
Well said. And folks, that's the end of side A for this episode. If you're here for the live stream, we'll be right back. If you are instead listening to this on a podcast platform in the very near future, then go ahead and join the Substack, subscribe, and that's how you'll get access to the B-side. Peace. I should say, we should always say what we're going to talk about on the B-side. I think we should probably get in the habit of that. So we're going to talk about the big thing that's been missing from this entire conversation, which is mass immigration, and the fact that a lot of the people who like this idea of multipolarity and there's some kind of cultural integrity are also thinking about how mass immigration washes away the ability for anybody in any society to have any sense of any kind of culture at all, because nobody shares the same reference points, much less language anymore, right? Like that whole idea, we'll get into it a little bit. And then we'll also be talking about Trump's cabinet picks and the week, because Benjamin is a student of the week, which is to say the mainstream discourse of the week, and and basically all of the outlets and their reactions to the election. So we'll be back with some spicy stuff, folks, right after this. Don't go anywhere.
Thanks, guys.
Only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place For workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation. Theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Zizek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Zizek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button, subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McCarrickers are doing, then the best way is to become a tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, tier 4 is amazing because it gives you tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people. Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my God. It's just so awkward. Thank you, Patreon. Patrons. Thank you. Oh, okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons. Thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side as well as...
And we're back. What's up, everybody? How's it going?
It's good to be back, isn't it?
Yeah, it was
I like
nice.
being
I
back.
like being back. I just had a quick little breakfast. One of those little waffle treats that they have for runners. When I was trying to get into running this year, I bought a bunch of them. And now instead of running, I just eat the treats for runners. You know.
Well, at least you're healthy on the inside.
Look, there's got to be ways to be healthy that don't include running. That's
Oh, there definitely are.
yeah.
I have a rule of thumb in my life. I only run as part of team sports.
You run for team sports?
Yeah, like if I'm playing basketball, I can get myself to run because I actually want to be a good teammate. But if I am just being asked to run by myself for no particular reason or to compete against myself in terms of speed, I don't care.
I think that's exactly how I feel. That is exactly how I feel. Basically, if other people are involved, it's a lot easier for me to do it. This self-motivation when it comes to these things is not really a thing for me. But it's like with jujitsu, showing up is the only hard part. But as soon as I'm there, because I'm with other people and there's real stakes to the game, like you're gonna look like an idiot and get folded by a 12-year-old, like, you know, which did happen when I don't know actually how old that person was, but there was like a kid who basically just like took me down, and it was just like, it's very humbling, and there's real stakes in that kind of dynamic. Like you could get hurt if you're not present. And so, you know, a sports situation with stakes can pull me out of my headspace that I tend to be in. But just going on a run by myself, no, nothing can pull me out of my normal headspace. And then I'm just like, what is the point of this again? I'm just hurting my knees for no reason.
Yeah, it also is very rough on your joints compared with even, say, swimming, especially if you do it for many years. Yeah, I've always been more of a team sports guy. You can get me to play soccer or basketball or what have you. But if you're just asking me to run for the sake of running, I go, I'd rather not.
Yeah. I want to shout out, before we get going with our B-side, I want to shout out Mike from Substack. He tagged us and said, polite reminder to re-up for the B-side. Last time, Mike said, hey, did you spam this out like when you went on the B-side? Basically, the point is like working the socials a little bit is wise. It's a smart thing to do for us. Otherwise, we're just over here in utter obscurity, which I'm always kind of fine with, right? Part of the point at Theory Underground is that we're fine with that. This is more of a word of mouth thing anyway. And it's more of a DIY word of mouth kind of vibe. But we are looking to, in the next year, expand a little bit. And with that, you do have to think a little bit about this kind of thing. And I'm excited to let you all know that we have a position opening up for the Substack, for the socials, for a lot of the posting, a lot of the stuff that keeps me busy in this sort of death by a thousand cuts way. I like that term that Benjamin uses it, death by a thousand cuts. Every time you're trying to do something, then you have to do something to follow up on a little notification. It just like ruins your ability to really focus and get anything done at the scholarly level. And so, yeah, there's a position opening up. Basically, the reason that we have a paywall and that people are able to subscribe is because we want to be able to pay somebody to do that kind of thing. And Mike, there's a job opening. I'm just joking, but I mean, really, like if somebody has a lot of experience and is really good at this kind of thing, do let us know. We are currently talking to a couple of people already. It might take a team though. So with that said, I'm ready to switch gears here. If you are,
Yeah, let's do it.
okay. So I'm going to take I'm going to leave up this graph for a little bit longer. Because we want to start out with the mass immigration thing. So let's shouldn't we like say something to start off the B side? Like, do we just repeat we haven't been.
We could repeat the A side opener. That's what I would typically do. Where I go, hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker, and you go, and I'm David McCarricker with Why Left.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McCarricker with Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk about things like immigration. We're going to talk a little bit about the Trump cabinet nominations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the week. Oh, look, it's Donald Trump on a throne with his fist in the air. What is the mainstream media saying about that? We'll get into it all on this hour. So, Dave, what would you like to start with?
So I'm no expert here, but when it comes to mass immigration, let's see. I've read a couple things, that get passed around on Substack. I'm aware that there were some serious protests in England not too long ago, and that these protests were sparked because the child of immigrants killed somebody, and there was this attempt on the part of the mainstream media to kind of be a little vague about it. They didn't want it to get back to the locals that this was a child of immigrants. And then there was miscommunication around the whole thing. People were saying that it was just like a first-gen immigrant who was doing this. It broke into like race riots, right? There was a lot of, go back home. We don't like you. Muslims no more. Let's burn down the mosques. Versus this sort of PMC liberal left progressive Keir Starmer approach that was like, how dare you talk about this, you racist workers. And Nina Power, friend of the show, she was featured on the last episode that just went live on Spotify, is very openly anti this sort of Keir Starmer censorship regime. But of course, she was also against the British anti-student protest censorship that was occurring, I think, 10 years ago, right? And so this has been a consistent position for her for a long time. But things seem to have escalated. You can get arrested for tweets now, right? People are getting pulled out of their homes and put in jail because they said something that the government doesn't like, usually about immigration. And so the concern about mass immigration, if you read someone like Christopher Rufo, or there's this other guy, Matt's with a G. I'm forgetting his last name off the top of my head, but he's famous on Substack. And he talks about anti-immigration or mass immigration. The narrative is that white people have become a minority in Britain in the space of like 20 years, very quickly. And it's not just white people. If you go a step further, and I think that this is kind of where you should go, the point is that it's multi-generational families are becoming more of a minority. So that's my best attempt to say what the discourse is saying right now. What do you make of this, Benjamin?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is people are exaggerating certain elements here. It's not like everybody in the UK who expresses a right-wing view is going to prison. There are some people in connection with the rioting who posted during rioting who got arrested and have been sent to prison. And that's terrible and shouldn't be occurring. But it's not like people are just in huge numbers being arrested for being right-wing on the internet in Europe. It's people who are doing it at times when it seems to the state to be in some way, shape, or form related to rioting. And then the state is making a very hasty connection, which it is often not making itself prove adequately, and then using that to lock people up. But it's not like there's very totalizing incarceration of people just for having any kind of right-wing view in Europe. That can be exaggerated. It also can be exaggerated what the level of demographic change is in the UK. Right now in the UK, 81% of the population of England and Wales identified as white in the 2021 census. Right? So it's still the case that you have well over 80% of the UK population thinking of itself as white. This includes 74% who identify as white English. Now, that's different from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it would have been 90%. So there's been a change, but it's also not like all of a sudden the UK is the United States demographically. There are certain parts of the UK that are like the United States demographically. If you look at London or maybe Birmingham, some of these large cities in the UK, there the demographic change has been sharper and more noticeable. But it's not like the UK is majority minority. That would be an exaggeration. Now, what I want to say about mass immigration is that this is something that happens when niches are collapsing in some parts of the world. When you have states that don't have a very stable position with regard to consumption, production, extraction, and there are large numbers of people who can't find a role for themselves that leads to a stable way of living, then they look for somewhere else to go. And particularly if there's war, if there's violence, that will tend to drive them out. But often it can be just because there is no economic program in that state that is working for them. If you have interaction, the more interaction you have, the more trade you have, the easier it is for everybody to move around generally. So what will tend to happen is if you have very large gaps in the quality of life in different parts of the world, people will move from the places that are doing very badly to the places that are doing much better if they can, right? And when this is happening, it's often because the whole world system is not doing as well as it would like to be doing. One of the things that's been going on really since the 70s is that the growth in the whole world system has been somewhat lower than people in the 50s and 60s thought it would be. People in the 50s and 60s looked at the period between the 20s and the 60s and thought there would be exponential growth or something very much like that, very high growth, that if anything might get even higher still as technological change accelerated. You hear this sometimes today in terms of the language of a singleton or accelerationism. Some of the tech futurists still have this kind of view, but it used to be much more common in the 50s and 60s because the actual historical life experience of people fit it better than it does now. In any case, the growth beginning in the 70s and really since then has been 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP lower than in the 50s and 60s. So the world has not gotten rich as fast as it expected to. And one of the consequences of this is that there has been a lack of adjustment in the rich states to this reality. And so when people move to the rich states to try to get the access to the higher quality niches, higher quality social roles, these rich states, they don't have the infrastructural capacity to fully accommodate that, right? Yet at the same time, if the rich states respond by trying to exit the system and cut themselves off from the system of trade, that will make their economic situations worse. right? So you're in a situation where you have enough growth and you're rich enough that you're attractive to people who are in states where the situation is very bad. But you've not had enough growth to be able to handle the organic inflow of people that that's leading to, nor have you had enough growth to make the kinds of investments that would be necessary around the world to give people a reason to stay in their home countries, right? This is a consequence of the whole world system just not being well managed enough and not growing fast enough. We are not producing people who are capable, for various reasons, of delivering on the necessary technological change and growth to make this a smooth process. So problems come out of this for everybody all over the world. And then it becomes a question of how to manage this, right? If you physically prevent people from moving to the rich states, that may cause further disturbances in the states where they are originally from. Those disturbances could spread to other nearby states that are currently doing better. Because if they can't move to the rich states that are able to control their borders, they may move to middle-income states that have less control, right? States have only so much capacity to manage these things, and you can overwhelm a state's capacity to police its own border or to be able to allocate people to social roles, right? In the case of the rich states, we probably could police the border significantly better than we currently do. In fact, we know we can because when Barack Obama was president in the United States, we used to deport 400,000 people a year. So, of course, we could manage the border in a way that would make it more restrictive to entry. But there is also this question of, if you do that, what will happen in the states that these people are from? Or what will happen in other neighboring states that these people might choose to move to instead? Could that have other economic effects in the world system that we may not anticipate, right? Then there's also this question of, a lot of the time in rich states, there is an effort by elites to take on a certain number of immigrants for the purposes of keeping wages down. And this is true. Usually, these states want to throttle that in such a way that it's not obtrusive and that it doesn't have such a negative effect on wages and growth that it produces debt problems for people in the rich states as they try to keep up with their consumption, or major disturbances insofar as it produces a need for infrastructure that you don't have the ability to support or fund. And this is why the aim for these people is always to throttle the number of immigrants that comes in. They don't want it to be as many as possible. And this is why, for instance, when the European Union was expanding, it was always 2 or 3 states at a time, so that there would be time to have the exchange that typically occurs when a state enters the European Union, which is that a chunk of its population moves to Western Europe, and then there's a chunk of Western European capital that moves to that state to help develop it, to throttle and limit the number of people who leave, right? And they'll talk about, and they used to all the time, the brain drain problem in Eastern European countries when there's too much migration and not enough investment, right? Because what does the investment do? Well, A, it creates return to capital for the rich people in Western Europe who have that money. But then B, it also limits the number of people who have to leave to look for work in Western Europe. So it throttles that migration process. And this is what they do. They try to make sure that they get just the right amount so that it's not a political problem. What happened in the late 2000s is that because of the Iraq War and the disturbances that that war caused in the Middle East, there were much more people trying to move to Europe than was needed by rich people in European states to achieve their goals and targets. Now, initially, at the beginning of the migrant crisis, some of the European leaders looked at this as a potential positive solution to their population issues and their demography problems. Angela Merkel, initially in Germany, very much was receptive to the idea that a certain number of migrants should move from the Middle East, especially as the EU expansion efforts had stalled out after the 2008 war in Georgia. It became much harder to imagine admitting more Eastern European states to the European Union. That became a much more fraught and difficult process, right? As we're seeing now in Ukraine, it's a much more fraught and difficult process. So to have some number of migrants from the former colonial empires would not be necessarily a terrible thing from their point of view. But they don't want so many that it produces an infrastructure problem, a political problem, a problem where you can't get elected. And so as these political disturbances have mounted in Europe, there has been a move, not just by the right-wing parties, but also by the liberal parties, to have a somewhat more restrictive immigration system. The thing is, the European border is the Mediterranean Sea for much of the border. That is a very difficult border to control because you can't just have a line of boats across it. People are always going to be able to cross the Mediterranean Sea. This is the thing about the Mediterranean Sea. It's actually a fabulous way of producing an enormous amount of trade. When you have peace and stability all the way around it, you can produce something like, I think it's called the Roman Empire, that has an enormous level of economic activity relative to the level of technology available at the time, because the Mediterranean is this fabulous pond that's so easy to cross and so placid that you can have primitive little boats that don't even have the ability to be ocean going, and they can hop across the Mediterranean with no trouble at all. The Mediterranean is a powerful way of linking together states. And if we could create stability in North Africa and the Middle East, the Mediterranean would produce an enormous amount of growth in Europe, an enormous amount of economic activity. If we could make sure that all of the states around it were stable and happy and interacting with each other. But we haven't been able to do that. In fact, our attempts to do that have made the situation worse in recent decades. Every time the West has tried to fix a country in North Africa or the Middle East, in recent years, it has made the situation less stable and damaged economic activity in that area. So for that reason, there's now a question of managing the consequences of that. In the United States, it's a much easier thing to do because the border is a river, the Rio Grande, for most of it in the South. The Canadian border is not nearly the same level of issue because Canada as a state is not dramatically poorer than the United States. The niches and social roles available in Canada are roughly comparable. They're not exactly as good, but they're roughly comparable. And then it's incredibly difficult to cross the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. But this makes the problem more manageable in the States, and it's why we tend to talk more about illegal immigration. Whereas in Europe, the language of mass migration tends to be used. Because in Europe, it's much harder to make these kinds of distinctions. In practice in Europe, what happens is that people move, and then you have to decide what to do about it. And you don't really get a chance to...
Coming up on The Whole Story.
That was not supposed to happen. All right, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. It's much harder to sort people because what happens is that people get to Europe, whether you intend for them to or not. And then there's a question of what to do with them. And the idea of deporting enormous numbers of them is logistically nightmarish from the point of view of European officials.
And
it's
brutal.
Very, very challenging.
It's also brutal.
Which is why what they usually do is they try to pay border states to try to control the problem. So they will offer an enormous amount of money to governments in Turkey or Egypt or Tunisia to prevent people from setting sail from port cities in the territory of these states. And these states have cottoned on that they can extract an enormous amount of money from the Europeans in exchange for performing this service. They can charge a lot because the Europeans don't have any other mechanism, really, that has any level of efficacy. The Italians used to run a patrol service in the Mediterranean that was better and good at preventing people from dying in shipwrecks. But the Italians cut that program because it was expensive and other European states were not helping the Italians to fund it. The Europeans have a coordination problem. They're not able to collectively raise money. They very much struggle to agree on expensive solutions that require joint efforts, especially physical efforts. There are deep problems in Europe that come out of the way the Euro crisis was handled and the animosities that were generated by the ways in which the pain was directed at often the poorest and weakest European states. So it makes it very, very difficult there to deal with the problem. And this is resulting in more inflammatory language about Muslims or about people from the Middle East or Asia or Africa. The thing is, all of that talk where you target or you blame the people who are moving, it doesn't really deal with the actual problem, which is that you have states around the world that aren't growing very well, where there isn't much of an incentive for people to stay, such that they put themselves at enormous risk to try to move, often illegally, to countries that don't want them. They know that they're not wanted, and they know that it's dangerous to go, and they're often taken advantage of by various human traffickers on the way, right? And yet, the Western states are also not growing well enough to make large-scale investments that would enable people to stay. What we're seeing is that certain states are doing well enough that they're able to keep their populations from leaving, like China. But many, many other states, there's been backsliding, there's been environmental disturbances related to climate change, there's been population growth that makes it harder to handle, harder to find roles for people, even as the economy grows.
Are there not a lot of Chinese people coming through the US-Mexico border? I saw a whole deep dive into this. I think it was put out by Vice. And it was just like, they spent a day at this one border crossing spot. And it's like, yeah, everyone coming through was Chinese. And they're all like middle-class Chinese people who are just like, yeah, it's just cheaper this way.
Well,
I don't
there
know what
has
to make
been
of
some
that.
poll by companies in California. Companies in California, tech companies, would like to be able to bring in legally more tech workers from East Asia who are highly skilled. And they'd also like to keep more Asian students who go to American universities, get engineering degrees, get degrees in the sciences. They'd like to be able to keep those students. Some of that is about wage control, but some of it is also about, why should these people go back to these states which they view as potentially competitor states and give American science and technology to these potential competitor states? There are different ways of framing it, depending on whether you're coming at the issue from a more liberal standpoint or from a more conservative standpoint. Often these different ways of framing can be used in conjunction to get the policy that you want. Yeah. But it's this is part of the problem of not having any kind of effective governance at the level of the world system. We don't really have a way of dealing with these problems collectively. The
No.
international institutions that exist are talking shops, or they work mainly on the basis of trying to use debt and credit to control behavior,
Right.
which means that oftentimes you're making the situation worse to try to make it better. If you're lending countries money and you're not creating conditions under which those loans can be successful, and then you're then blaming the countries for borrowing the money when they had no other alternative, they had nothing else that they could do, because their set of options is very limited. You get very bad situations. And this is also why, by the way, many of these Western states welcome attempts by China to become a creditor state in South America and Africa, because these Western creditors want Chinese creditors to have to deal with the delinquent borrowers in those parts of the world, which has for a long time been a point of frustration for them. So if China wants to compete to offer credit to these states, the thing that I think many people don't realize is that the Westerners are offering this credit because if they don't offer credit, there will be major problems in many cases that will be more expensive in the long run than offering the credit. It's not necessarily because people want to lend money that this is occurring. It's because there is a need to prevent disorder. And this is the interconnectedness, which I think many people miss. They act like each of these states is an individual going to the supermarket, and making a transaction as an individual unit. And really, there's management. And sometimes you'll have cases where the US president will go and talk to another head of government and ask that person to lend money to a third country so that that third country is stabilized. And then the president will say, if you do this, we'll appreciate it, and maybe we'll do something for you. This way of trying to buck pass and kick around who has to be the creditor, this goes on all the time.
So I want to get into why I care and also why I think that there's an important side of this that is missing that you already kind of touched on it, which is just kind of like what we're being posed with here is what Slavoj called the double bind, right? He wrote a book about this, and he calls it a double bind, which is just like, either more immigration or less. But first, I do want to spend a little bit more time in what I'll just call the discourse for now, and so the Matt G, I was trying to remember the last name. It's Matt Goodwin, okay, and so he's got this Substack post, Britain's population explosion in 10 stats. Now, the thing is there's this interesting thing going on where U.S. immigration is very different from the this British immigration, and so you've already touched on that a little bit, and I want to bring it back to U.S. immigration in a second. But just to put this one away, I just want to hit on a couple of these stats that he brings up. So because let's see, there's a paywall after the fourth stat, so we can just read through the first four, and I think it's worth doing because his Substack really is one of the most popular for addressing this issue. So he says, 1, according to the very latest data from the Office of National Statistics released this week, in the year ending June 2023, the population of the United Kingdom grew by 662,400 people to 68.2 million people, a growth rate of 1%. This 1% might not sound like a lot, but it is the sharpest increase in our population since 1971 and reflects the ongoing population explosion that I've written about previously. And he links here what Britain will look like in 2036, right? Which, spoiler alert, it's going to be a lot browner and it's going to be more Muslim, right? 3, and this will now only accelerate in the years ahead unless we change course. By the year 2036, only 12 years away, the government's own forecast suggests another 6.6 million people will arrive in the country, equivalent to about 5 cities the size of Birmingham, taking the population to 74 million people. By the late 2040s, on current numbers, the population will expand by around 20 million people, equivalent to 18 cities the size of Birmingham. 4, what's driving this? Well, what we also learned this week is that more people are now dying than being born among the British population, which is the first time this has happened for half a century. In fact, the native population declined by 16,300 people in the year ending June 2023, reflecting the ongoing fertility crisis that will now become a constant in our national life unless, again, we rapidly change course. I think you touched on this in a previous episode. You were bringing up the fact that they're not even the British population is not reproducing itself enough, and they have to bring in this other labor, right? So then he says the replacement rate for a country whereby it is reproducing itself over time is 2.1, but in Britain this rate has slumped from 3.0 in the 1960s to 1.5 in 2022. Is forecast to crash to 1.38 by the year 2050 and then 1.3 by 2100, making it impossible to keep the population stable. In other words, what demographers call natural negative change among the native population alongside the other key changes below will now only accelerate in the years ahead. So this is, and of course, if you want to access the rest of it, you have to become a paying subscriber. Pew, 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 pew.
Dave, let me show you something that I think provides good context for this. I just sent it to you in Messenger.
Perfect.
Maybe we can put this on the screen.
Yeah, I'll pull it over here.
Yeah.
Let's do it like this. Here we go. So what we have, what is this graph? You want to explain this?
Yeah, so this is UK GDP per capita, and it shows you both what actually happened in blue, in light blue, the pre-COVID trend, and in light red, the pre-2008 trend. So as you can see, this is a country that is much poorer than it expected to be, not just versus what it expected in the 50s and 60s, but versus what it expected in the 90s and 2000s. And when you have a country that's much poorer than it expected to be, people decide to have much fewer kids than they expected they would have. And when it's still the case that even though this country is much poorer than people expected it to be, it's much richer than many other countries, particularly many other countries that used to be part of its colonial empire, where there's a significant amount of English language education, then people in those other countries think, why don't I move to the UK? I have cultural ties to the UK. I have learned English in school. I went to a school that's modeled off British institutions. The common law in my country is British law. And why shouldn't such a person think that they might fit in the UK? And in many cases, by the way, they do fit in reasonably well. Because while people may imagine that an Eastern European immigrant would have more in common with an English person, in many cases, someone from Nigeria or Kenya has much more exposure to British-style institutions, laws, and customs.
So what you're doing here is bringing it back to the economy, of course, and specifically like people are not going to have babies if they're broke or if they are if they're really feeling it. But what do you say
then
then
you
to
get into a death spiral? The fewer babies that you have, the more you need migrants to keep the population young enough to have a viable social system.
But
so you get into this situation where
yeah, I mean, I get it, but what about the fact that liberals are like anti-baby? Like that liberal institutions, the progressives, that every PMC liberal party I've ever been to, one of the things you can be absolutely certain of is that there's going to be people standing around talking about how they don't want to have kids because, oh, ew, and that they're not birthers. And there's just this kind of like hatred of babies and families coming from academia and the media. If it's not hatred, then it's just a sort of indifference or a kind of above that. Are you saying that's just economic precarity and then people are rationalizing it?
Well, if you think about it from the level of the world system, there is a problem that the growth in the world has not been high enough to accommodate population growth in the world without major social and political disturbances, right? So while you might, in principle, you might imagine you might be able to solve this problem by boosting the birth rate in the Western European states. But from the point of view of the world system, this just creates increases the total number of people who have to find social roles in a global economy that's not growing that quickly. And the global economy is not growing that quickly. And part of the reason why, by the way, is that there is less connection between growth and human labor. Human labor is a declining factor of production, as it always is in capitalism. So one of the consequences of this is that you are not necessarily going to increase the amount of growth by increasing the population size of the planet. You would generate a little bit of additional economic activity just by having to manage all of the people, but you're not necessarily going to benefit tremendously from an enormous amount of additional human labor. That isn't really the constraint globally on growth. So if you're thinking in global terms, which the globetrotting elite is, it's not necessarily an advantage to have even more people at a time when global growth rates are sluggish relative to what was expected, right? That might only seem to be a solution. So then they're sitting here and going, okay, would we rather fund families locally in our own states? That costs us money and it increases the total number of people on the planet, right? And then we have to spend money policing the border to stop people from moving in from other states, right? Or would we like to lend a bunch of money to the former colonial governments in these other parts of the world to try to generate growth in those places and prevent people from leaving? Well, most of the time when we do that, the loans don't work out, the growth doesn't happen, something else happens instead. The money ends up piling up in the elite in the capitals of these states, and most of the population never sees it. And very little good happens ultimately for anybody, except we lend out a bunch of money and get a bad return on it, right? Or we can alleviate the problem in these developing states by taking some of the population And then we don't
Right.
have to spend money funding families locally. And perhaps this will reduce the intensity of the environmental pressures. And this is the way that the thinking has tended to go.
Part of what I was bringing into this with that, well, they actually hate children. This is actually part of a real force in the world that is anti-natalist. The reason I'm bringing it in part, is because, for me at Theory Underground, there's like a frame of reference, and it's the people that I've brought into the Epic Marathon streams. And one of those people is part of a 2-person operation, the Collinses, right? And I brought on Malcolm Collins, and they write these pragmatists guides. And one of the pragmatist guides they wrote was the Pragmatist Guide to, I think it's called Constructing Religion or Crafting Religion or something like that. And I gave it a skim and then talked to him on the channel. And they're both controversial figures. People think of them as eugenicists of some sort. But of course, in a sort of biopolitical sense, they're all about natalism. They're pro-natalist, right? They just think that there needs to be serious incentives there, but they also think it's too late. They think that the fertility crisis is so extreme at this point that the only realistic way forward is going to be the mass production of babies in test tubes or whatever kind. I mean, I don't know. They get a little sci-fi with it. And it's, I would love to have a whole conversation about that with you and him and maybe his wife, Simone. But for right now, kind of on that theme, what he is saying is that this cultural liberalism that is fiercely individualistic is a mimetic virus, and that all ideologies are mimetic, but that what makes it sort of like this parasitical, suicidal kind of virus, as far as memes go, is that it requires the young of other people's children in order to grow, because it is itself anti-natalist. And so it's through the universities and the messaging from the media, it's constantly pushing this rugged individualist or consumer, more likely consumer individualist, not rugged, but consumer individualist sort of narrative that can only perpetuate itself by taking the children from other communities, from other cultures, from other ideologies. Right now, I think it's a fascinating way of thinking. I would love to get your take on it, but I also wanted to tie it into, and Anne just sent me these tweets from Matt Walsh, famous Daily Wire guy who just had a blockbuster, hilarious documentary, Am I Racist, in theaters, where he basically goes around and does a sort of Bo Rat routine, pretending to be a woke person and really just letting people like Robin DiAngelo show themselves for what they are. It's a whole thing I talked about with Anne and the Swoletariat on Swole's channel, the Swoletariat. You can all go check it out there if you want. But what he said is, there are a lot of reasons why people aren't having kids these days. The economy isn't one of them. That's a cop-out, an excuse offered by selfish people who are too afraid to admit they're selfish. People with fewer resources than you have been reproducing since the beginning of human civilization. Now, I'm going to read the whole thread here, but I just want to say quickly aside, for me and Anne, it is 100% an economic thing. So I do not agree with this entirely, but he's got a point here. Poor people do reproduce. Then he says, literally billions of people have done the thing that we are now told can't be done unless you have 100,000 in savings. If people had this attitude in the past, the human species wouldn't exist anymore. It's just nonsense. We all know it's nonsense. I can't afford it. Billions of people, billions, have afforded it with less. Billions. How is it that you can't do something that has been done under more difficult circumstance billions of times? Stop making excuses. At least be honest. And then he, in this thread, had retweeted somebody named Deeds, where they said, these grandparents should have built enough generational wealth so their kids would feel financially secure enough to start a family. And what he says is, this is the bullshit I'm talking about. Why do you need generational wealth to start a family? What makes you so special? I started a family with no generational wealth. Again, billions of people have, but you're special. You're different. Okay. All right, Benjamin, what do you say to Matt Walsh?
Well, he thinks that that we should be okay with being declassed. And he thinks that we should have children on the intention of their being declassed. And the reason that immigrants are brought in to replace the babies is that what they want is poor people who will work for very little. And what he's saying is we can have more babies. They just have to be poor people who will work for very little. And if you aren't willing to have babies because you don't want to condemn your future children to being poor people who have to work for very little, then you're selfish. This just works from the premise that what's needed in the rich states is poor people who will work for very little. Really, this is what they want, poor people who will work for very little. And they don't care where they come from. They would be perfectly happy for us to make them. But that's what they want. They don't want more middle-class people who have high aspirations, high expectations, who want the world to be better, who have demands to be emancipated from labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They want people who are just happy to have a role, right? If you come from a very poor state and you have experienced an enormous amount of poverty, and you're able to get some kind of job in a rich state that pays, 30 or 40 grand, that is a huge improvement for you. If you're able to even make, in many cases, 20 grand, that is often a huge improvement for a person. Such a person is likely to be satisfied with that and to not make further demands on the state, on society. What they are trying to do is wind down this population of high expectations, millennials and boomers that came out of the post-war era, either directly out of it or second generation from the post-war era, who think that this enormous amount of economic growth should emancipate large numbers of people from labor, or make it such that you can, at the very least, enjoy a much higher standard of living with much more day-to-day consumption. These are things that are being wound down, and they're being wound down in large part because these guys have a scarcity mindset. And a lot of the climate politics, the eco-austerity, goes part and parcel with this, right? These people think that we're just not going to have a very large amount of growth, and we're certainly not going to have a large enough amount of growth to emancipate billions of people from labor or to allow billions of people to become first world citizens with all of the consumption expectations that would go along with that. And since they believe this, since they think it's not possible to generate that level of growth, they've retreated into a much more conservative image of human life. And they think that what will eventually happen if we're going to keep having more people is that large numbers of people will have to accept being peasants because the growth will not support their being something else, and that you ought to just get used to this. And it's easy enough for him to say he makes plenty of money personally, and he and his family are not going to be directly affected. He may not have had generational wealth when he started having kids, but he's certainly got it now from all of the things that he's been up to. So it's easy enough for people to say this when they're not directly affected. But the difficult thing is we are not having enough growth to support what we're doing. And so that the question then is, are we going to be able to find a way to regenerate the growth, or are we going to be on this, nasty scarcity track where people have to make hard decisions and everything becomes zero sum, and either you get it or I get it, and we have to decide who gets it, and the world becomes more competitive, and there's more incentive to get militaristic in that situation. And if you have that kind of mindset, if you surrender to the eco-austerians and you're waiting for the apocalypse, if that's your position, then you end up with something like Matt Walsh's view pretty quickly. What remains of the millennial generation, what remains of the boomers, is this image for a different kind of world. That you actually could use the technological development that is occurring to make the world much better for a large number of people, that actually can be done. And once you drop the belief that that can be done, then you drop belief in modernity itself as a concept, in capitalism itself as a transformational concept. You abandon belief in all of these things and you retreat into a much more pessimistic kind of position, under which it seems to make sense to bring back some kind of feudal arrangement. This is how people talk themselves into the idea that this is the way the world is headed. But it doesn't have to be this way. It really doesn't.
I think that's our job, is to always bring it back to that. But really quick, I've got the chat up on the screen here because I want to highlight something that Nance has said. I'm also going to show the poll that I started in a second, but first I want to show the previous poll that I had up, because that's right, podcast listeners on the live stream side of things, I do poll the audience from time to time. Of course, if you're listening to this after the fact, you can always let us know your opinion about your answer to a poll in the comment section, either on YouTube or I'm not really sure if you can in the comment section on a podcast episode, but maybe on some platforms. Anyway, the first one was, is mass immigration a problem? And then there were three options: yes, no, and wrong question, which is the winner. 56% of you think that is the wrong question to be asking if mass immigration is a problem. And I'm guessing that comes down to something like, the other kinds of positions we've been talking about here. There's other ways of framing the entire situation, right? But 29% of you said it is a problem, and 14% of you said no, not a problem. And that's out of 57 votes. So thanks for voting, everybody. Great to kind of have that pulse on you all. Benjamin, of course, just so you know, technologically, I can always pull anybody on anything that you ever want me to ask them. And then the one we currently have up is, has economic conditions discouraged you or someone you love from having kids? 76% said yes. 6% said no. And 18% said,
honestly,
no,
it's the
I
most
just hate
encouraging
children.
thing about our situation that people will say yes to that, because it means that people still think that the world ought to be better than this, and that it certainly ought to be better than this for their kids. It's a sign of creative life from us that we would have this complaint. It shows that we have not completely acquiesced to this and naturalized it, because it's people like Matt Walsh who have acquiesced to it and naturalized it, who just operate from the premise that the next generation will live in more barbarized circumstances, enjoy lower wages, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm encouraged by all of you who are saying yes. It means that you actually have a standard for what is a life that's worth living, and we ought to have standards about that. We shouldn't just operate from the premise that any kind of life is worth it.
I 100% agree. And also just want to say, as a child of a huge family, or parents who made a huge family, who had this sort of Matt Walsh conservative mentality, it's anti-birth control. It's all about just let God decide how many kids you have. And, you know what? Poverty shouldn't factor into it. God will provide. People have done more with less. That technically worked out in the sense that, yes, we all survived. There was a big family and we all survived. But we were poor and in fact, extremely poor as a result. And I especially want to point out that even if you can make ends meet with money, which, my parents didn't learn to think in terms of class. It was never really, they intuited it a little bit. They had this sense of liberal elites or whatever, but they didn't really understand class. And I don't think that in their early days that they understood that the big families at their church that were making it work, for them, had a lot of money, right? And so they weren't really thinking in those terms. They were just thinking, oh yeah, this is going to work out. And when they were able to provide financially, they were not able to provide in terms of time, energy, and attention, right? The actual large energy-infused repeatable blocks of time reliably between people within a family is as the necessary condition for being able to actually love, nurture, and get to know your children, right? It's just not possible when you're working from before sunup until after sundown. This is something that's not clocking on Walsh's radar. But with that said, Strike said Matt Walsh is not a serious person. I think he's very serious, and that this sort of dismissive way of washing one's hands and not having to engage seriously with someone like Walsh is why Democrats just lost. And it's why his movie was a blockbuster, even without Democrats going and seeing it. It's because this idea that you don't have to engage seriously with conservatives makes for a wildly unpopular movement. You have to actually take them seriously. And they are serious people. They have real principles. They have a real perspective. He's not just a grifter. And going back to that documentary, he's also got a point sometimes. But with that said,
it's part of why we're getting overwhelmed by stupid stuff, because we don't fight it off. We go, oh, those are barbarians. Those are what barbarians think, and then we don't engage with it. And I do this too. You know, we all, I think, have a tendency to not want to spend our time dealing with stuff that we think is not very interesting. But sometimes you should have a friend like Dave, who makes you deal with it and forces you to explain to people why it's not the best possible take you could have.
Or you should have a friend like Matt Walsh. Not saying someone necessarily who like works for the Daily Wire, but I'm just saying having conservatives in your life and actually having real conversations with them and realizing it's not just a grift and it's not just a product of propaganda, but it actually is a real human way of seeing the world. And that even if they were more educated or lived in less harsh conditions, or if there was less bad propaganda, conservatives would still exist, right? Conservatives will always exist. There's always going to be a conservative element to the human spirit. It can be articulated differently. It can be reconfigured. And that's a whole thing I would like to get into later. Yeah. But now I want to point to
pessimism. It's really pessimism about growth, pessimism about what's possible, and therefore the suggestion that we should just naturalize what's around because it's not going to get any better.
I would say, yeah, but it's also, it's not just about, so you're getting at the point, and I like this, that, you know, we can kind of think about progress in terms of like a car. There's like, you know, turning around to the left, turning around to the right, but then there's like the gas and there's the brakes, and like the conservative impulse is to hit the brakes, whereas the progressive one is to hit the gas pedal. And
Well, that
totally
would be reactionary, right? Reactionary, I think, would be even to throw the car in reverse if you can.
You flip
but
it
most
around.
Most of the time, the conservatives don't even think they have control. They don't even think that you can do anything. They think that the car has always been there and you've always been sat in the car and it's always been in the same place.
Right.
So they tend to deny that anything ever really changes, or that, you know, if there are changes, they deny that you can control them in any way, shape, or form.
I would see, and then this is where I would say, I also think that insofar as when I was saying that conservative is like this, an element of the human spirit that's just always going to exist, what I'm getting at is the sort of superstition, hunch, or faith, or commitment that some things that we do have some kind of reason to them outside of the reasons that we've told ourselves, and that we don't know. And this sort of like Burkean idea, takes a long time to build a successful institution. Very quickly, it can be torn apart, right? And so it's like this sort of this hunch. You can't just make reality be whatever you want overnight. And that there are certain things, even if you can debunk them rationally, there might be a reason that they exist and we don't know what it is. And this doesn't have to be a things never change, but it can be a things can't just change as fast as you want them to. Does that make sense?
There are lots of different kinds of conservatism, but yeah, I was thinking really about this idea that there's an unchanging human nature, right? Or that there's certain things fundamentally about the human condition that don't change, or if they change, they change in a way that we don't control and can't rationally plan or reason about and then do anything about. There's a lack of horizon of possibility that tends to come out of, and there's lots of different ways to arrive there. We could have a whole episode about types and species of conservatism. We could break it into lots of different types.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. We should do that sometime.
Because whenever I do this thing that says that I have my progressive side, I have my conservative side, when I'm doing that, obviously I have a very specific idea of what I'm talking about, and it is not everybody else's idea, and it's something that I tend to trip up in conversations with other people about, and it's something that I'd like to dive in deeper with you on later. But right now, Nance said,
yeah.
And this is the reason I have this up on the screen here, folks. Nance said, look, as a poor who had a bunch of kids, I love them, wouldn't be here if not for them, but there is a huge guilt I carry for bringing them into the world we live in. And going off of the polls here, no, 79% of our audience are saying that it's the economic conditions that have discouraged them from having children, or someone that they love from having children. And I'll just say, Anne and I would already have 2 precious children if it wasn't for the fact that we are living in a piece of shit apartment and we're spending a ridiculous amount of money for this. Like if we actually had our own house and a few acres, oh, you bet we'd have kids already. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not looking to moralize about this. I think it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult situation for people to be in, large amounts of uncertainty. And yet we come from a world that told us that things should be possible, and they don't seem to be possible, even for us, let alone for people in 20 or 30 years. So it's a very challenging situation. I respect people for thinking seriously about it and not engaging in this kind of dismissive thing that Matt Walsh does, where the issue is not even treated seriously, and you're told that you should just mindlessly have kids, because that's what people in the past in peasant societies used to do. No, that's not thinking. That's something else. That's ordering people around and trying to shame them and bully them into doing what you think they should do. It's not even an argument. It's just an attempt to bully and shame people into doing what you think they should do.
All right, folks. So I brought in the Collins perspective. I brought in the Walsh perspective. I brought in the Matt Goodwin perspective. I feel like we've hit on all the stuff we want to. We did want to say a little bit about the cabinet picks, but we're also we're going pretty long here, so maybe we should come back and do that later in the week. I wanted to make sure to point out, just in terms of talking about the U.S. situation, I hate CNN. I really do. But they did this thing, and a couple of their journalists went to the Darien Gap, which is between Colombia and Panama, Colombia and Panama. And they made the trek with the South American immigrants who are coming to the United States. In a lot of cases, in most cases, are coming to the United States. And I just wanted to say, just the trek alone is more struggle and difficulty than the average American will ever see in their lifetime. And that there is this part of me that just wants to say, you know what, like Harris is right when she says, turn around, go back. This is not a good place to come to right now. But also, it's obviously a bad situation for them to be doing this trek where they often get separated from their family and die in the jungle, right? Not to mention that this whole journey is one that they're doing under the observation and with the help of the cartels that they are paying or going into debt to, which is itself a terrible situation. This is not a good situation for anybody. It's obviously terrible. And also, criminals do come across. Now, of course, there's going to be people who say, well, they're criminals if they come in the first place because they're here illegally. Yeah, but for a lot of Americans, that kind of crime is like jaywalking. It's not the real crime. The real crime is treating people in an inhumane way. And these kinds of immigrants are not they're not just illegal or undocumented, which are the two framings. No, they're being exploited by capital, right? They're being imported to do cheap labor, and it's largely cheap because it's completely unprotected. That's the whole point of like threatening somebody. Oh, well, we'll call ICE on you. You know, we'll have you deported if you disagree with the wages that we're paying you. So this is about labor and capital. You can't think about it as something that's not about labor and capital. And watching this is actually heartbreaking. And it should, if you have a shred of humanity, you should actually feel some kind of admiration for these people. Now, bringing it back to the left versus right in the United States, the only thing I want to say about it is whether you want to frame it as illegals or as undocumented, neither party does anything about the people who are exploiting this labor. And neither party presents anything that could resonate with the overwhelming majority of Americans. Send them back is not going to resonate with the overwhelming majority of Americans any more than abolish the border. And my position has been for years now, though I haven't written extensively about this or anything like that, but there are sort of middle of the road or like broadly appealing kinds of ways of addressing these crises that are not on the table. And the main one, tying it back to the A side of this episode, would be T-cubed institutions, right? Build institutions and cities for people who cannot live where they are, whether they're in the United States or elsewhere. Build them on the borders of places where there's a lot of traffic to get from one side into the other side. Build places for people to learn, to grow, to cultivate themselves. And this false bind between send them home or abolish the border, it's got to go. It only resonates with a very small faction of Americans. A lot of people are aware that immigration is a problem, but there's not real solutions being put forward. What I'm talking about with T3 institutions being built on borders is a real way forward, right? We're talking about people being able to get job training. We're talking about people being able to learn the language. We're talking about people being able to find the right place to move into where they're actually wanted and places where they're not just going to be exploited. And beyond job training, we're talking about people being able to cultivate themselves and build their family relationships, which ultimately is the bedrock of any successful civilization.
And we've got this problem of continuing to think in terms of nation state paradigms, of whether you take or don't take people who are coming from, some ether, some place that you don't think about, that you don't have any relation to. The truth of the matter is that the whole world system is integrated. It's because it's integrated that we have flows of money around the world, flows of goods around the world, and flows of people around the world. All of these flows are intimately connected to each other. So if you don't want people moving all over the world, you've got to come up with a way of directing funding or investment to the places that they're coming from so that those places become livable. And you're not going to have a nation state government that's going to prioritize a developmental strategy for territory of the world that is outside its own domain where the people can't vote. It's not going to be the case that an American government is going to come up with a Latin American growth strategy that makes it easy for people to stay where they are because they have no electoral incentive under the current political rules to do that. So to get to a stage where we can really think about how to manage this crisis collectively, we would have to think beyond the nation state as a unit. But we are still stuck in that paradigm. And as long as we're stuck in that paradigm, it's a competitive game for niches. It's a competitive game for roles. And people will tend to think, especially when growth rates are lower than expected, let me make sure I can get mine and screw everybody else. And that's the trouble. We don't have a good system at the level of the world for dealing with these crises when they come up. And people immediately go into the nation state or civilizational black boxes and try to hide from stuff.
All right, folks, my parents are coming into town. I'm about to go out on the town with them for the rest of the day. You've all already presumably met my dad, as did Benjamin, on episode 2 of this podcast. Well, I'm going to go hang out with him and mom and try to convince them that they should not be gloating right now because of Trump's amazing victory. And on that note, we'll be back maybe later this week. If so, probably Friday or next week on Monday, because currently we have some kind of a schedule, which is we're here every Monday. The time might vary a little bit, but we usually schedule it ahead of time. And so you can always be a part of the live audience if you're interested in that. And then if we do an additional episode, it's going to usually be on Friday, usually in the afternoon by U.S. time zones. And so, Benjamin, thank you so much. Any last words?
Well, it's just always great to hang out with you and talk to you about the problems that the world is facing and to hear some of the wacky things that people are saying on the internet that I would prefer not to read. It's always a pleasure, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you. Everybody, catch you on the next one. Take care.
Bye-bye.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Zizek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Zizek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button. Subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx. Oh, by the way, everybody, I know that the PSA is playing and you're sitting there watching it, trying to figure out how to get involved. And that's amazing and that's wonderful. And we love to have you still here. There's still 71 of you as concurrent viewers, and that's great. Well, I forgot to say, I'm going to redirect this chat into a new live stream, one that will be over at Nance's channel called 3 Billion Nances. And I feel real bad for not saying that when I had 130 people in the chat. We lost, a solid 50 of you. But stick around. You'll get to be a part of Nance's live stream. And if it doesn't automatically redirect you at the time that the PSA is over, just click the link that I'm about to share into the chat. All right? All right. I'll let the PSA finish now. Bye. Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McCarrickers are doing, then the best way is to become a Tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a Tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because Tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, Tier 4 is amazing because it gives you Tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people, Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my god, it's just so awkward. Thank you, Patreon. Patrons, thank you. Oh, okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons, thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why can't we do this?